blinding, but the chemistry on set was completely devastating. In 1964, Viva Las Vegas hit theater screens and sent shockwaves straight through Hollywood. Audiences cheered at the music, but behind the rolling cameras, a tragic countdown had already begun. There is one specific quiet scene in that movie where the acting stopped and real heartbreak took over the frame. It is a fleeting moment where two people looked directly into each other's eyes, saw their inevitable future, and realized they were trapped by their own fame. It remains the most genuine, painful sequence Elvis Presley ever filmed, and the truth behind it still breaks hearts today. The anatomy of a calculated collision. George Sidney walked across the polished floor of MGM Soundstage 24 on July 9, 1963. He was a veteran Hollywood director with a reputation for spotting raw talent. He stopped in front of a tall, red-headed 22-year-old woman wearing a simple checkered blouse. Ann-Margret was waiting nervously for her screen test. A moment later, a side door slammed open. Elvis Presley walked onto the floor, surrounded by 8 massive bodyguards wearing matching leather jackets. The director took both of them by the hand. He pulled them toward the center of the room. He introduced them simply, stating their names as if they were just two ordinary actors starting a standard studio gig. The studio crew went completely quiet. The introduction seemed routine on the surface, but the director knew exactly what he was doing when he brought them together. He was deliberately staging a corporate collision. Why did the studio executives feel the need to plant a dangerous spark right next to their biggest asset? The financial numbers from 1962 provided the answer. Elvis's recent movies were making money, but the box office returns were beginning to plateau. The plots were getting predictable. The soundtracks were getting stale. The teenagers were growing tired of seeing Elvis rescue helpless, soft-spoken starlets who faded into the background. MGM needed something radical to shake up the formula. They needed a performer who could challenge the king's dominance on the screen. They found their answer in a young Swedish immigrant who had just stolen the show in the movie Bye Bye Birdie. The press was already calling her the female Elvis. She had the same explosive energy. She had the same suggestive hip movements. The moment Elvis looked at Ann-Margret on that soundstage, the corporate plan completely backfired. The studio wanted a healthy professional rivalry to generate tabloid headlines. Instead, they got an immediate, consuming obsession. The first rehearsal session began an hour after the introduction. The piano player started banging out a fast-paced rhythm in the corner of the room. Elvis usually took charge of these sessions immediately. He would tell the band how to play and tell the co-stars where to stand. This time, he didn't say a word. He just stood by the microphone, watching Ann-Margret move. She didn't wait for his permission to start dancing. She kicked off her high-heeled shoes and threw herself into the choreography. She matched his internal rhythm, note for note. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's tight circle of childhood friends and bodyguards, watched from the wings. They were used to handling standard Hollywood actresses who flitted around Elvis to get into the gossip columns. They instantly recognized that this woman was different. She wasn't intimidated by the entourage. She didn't look at Elvis like he was a god. She looked at him like he was an equal. By the third day of shooting on location in Las Vegas, the production schedule was completely off the rails. The daily film rushes were sent back to the studio heads in Los Angeles. The executives sat in their dark screening rooms, looking at the black and white test footage. They saw something that terrified them. The cameras weren't just capturing a fun musical comedy about race cars and showgirls. The lenses were tracking a real-time chemical reaction. Every time the director called action, the rest of the set seemed to vanish. When Elvis and Ann-Margret shared a frame, their dialogue became secondary. The way they leaned into each other during a simple conversation looked entirely unscripted. They laughed at jokes that weren't in the script. They touched each other's hands between takes while the makeup artists tried to apply powder. The crew members began talking in whispers behind the scenery flats. They noticed that Elvis was changing his daily routine. He stopped eating his meals inside his private trailer. He started sitting at the main commissary table, right next to Ann-Margret. He even stopped listening to his own record players during the breaks. Instead, he sat quietly on a wooden apple box, listening to her talk about her childhood in a small Swedish village. But this sudden connection wasn't happening in a vacuum. There was a major problem waiting back in Tennessee. A large stack of mail arrived at the Sahara Hotel where the cast was staying. It was late July, Inside the packages were handwritten letters from a young woman living inside the gates of Graceland. Priscilla Beaulieu was reading the Hollywood trade papers every morning. The headlines were becoming increasingly explicit. The tabloids were printing full-page pictures of Elvis and Ann-Margret riding a motorcycle through the desert sand during a break in filming. Elvis looked at the letters on his dressing table. He didn't answer them right away. He slid them into a drawer and locked it with a small key. The atmosphere on the set grew tense as August approached. The early infatuation was turning into something much heavier. The two stars were spending every night together, slipping away from the bodyguards to drive through the dark mountain roads outside Las Vegas. They found small, out-of-the-way diners where the truckers didn't care about movie stars. They talked for hours about the suffocating nature of their contracts. Ann-Margret was discovering that the king of rock and roll was completely broke in every way that mattered. He didn't control his own money. He didn't choose his own songs. He was a prisoner of his own massive brand. Elvis was discovering a woman who shared his exact artistic frustrations. She wanted to do serious drama. She wanted to sing raw blues tracks. The studio wanted her to be a cartoon sex symbol. They were two highly tuned instruments being played by corporate hands. The director watched them from his canvas chair during a lighting setup. He saw them standing near the edge of the stage, whispering together in the shadows. He realized that the calculated collision he had staged on day one was spinning completely out of his control. He had wanted a hit movie. He had accidentally unlocked a tragedy. The true test of their alliance was about to arrive. The production was moving into the heavy musical numbers, where they would have to face each other directly in front of the lens. The studio was about to find out that when you put two suns in the same sky, someone is bound to get burned. The battle for the screen kernel. Tom Parker stood at the back of the screening room on August 12, 1963. He chomped down on a half-lit cigar. The white screen lit up with the daily film rushes from the musical number, "Come On Everybody." On screen, Ann-Margret was sliding across the floor in a tight red sweater. She didn't look like a background dancer. She held the center of the frame. Her energy completely matched Elvis's movements. The Colonel didn't look happy. He tapped his heavy cane against the floorboards. He saw a massive threat to his carefully managed empire. For nearly 10 years, the Colonel had run Elvis's career with an iron fist. The rule book was simple. Elvis was the sun. Every other actor on the set was a minor planet revolving around him. Co-stars were hired to look pretty and say short lines of dialogue. They were never supposed to steal the spotlight. Why was the Colonel suddenly panicking over a 22-year-old actress? The contract details showed the source of his anger. George Sidney, the director, was a massive fan of Ann-Margret. He had quietly altered the shooting angles. He gave her more close-ups than any previous female lead. He even gave her the favorable side of the lighting grid. The Colonel realized that his top star was being shared equally with a newcomer. The next morning, the Colonel marched straight into the office of MGM studio chief Joe Vogel. He slammed his hand onto the mahogany desk. He demanded that the editing team cut Ann-Margret's solo close-ups out of the final print. He threatened to pull Elvis from all future MGM promotional tours if the studio didn't comply. The studio executives were caught in the crossfire. They wanted a hit movie, but they couldn't afford to lose the king. Back on the soundstage, the tension was entirely invisible to the two stars. They were rehearsing the song, "I Need Somebody to Lean On." Elvis sat at a piano on the set, running through the chord progressions. Ann-Margret leaned against the wood casing, humming along with the melody. The director called for a lunch break. The crew cleared out, leaving the two of them alone under the heavy overhead rafters. Elvis stopped playing the keys. He looked up at her and talked about the Colonel's midnight visits to his trailer. The Colonel was constantly screaming about brand protection. He wanted Elvis to stop changing his vocal style during the duets. He wanted him to sing louder to drown out her voice in the audio mix. Did Elvis listen to his manager's demands, or did he protect his co-star? The audio tracks from that afternoon revealed the answer. When the tape rolled for the final recording session, Elvis did the exact opposite of what the Colonel wanted. He pulled back his vocal volume. He leaned away from his microphone during her verses, giving her voice the clean space it needed to resonate. It was a quiet act of rebellion against his own management. The Memphis Mafia watched this play out from the shadows of the studio wings. They were loyal to Elvis, but they were paid by the corporate machine. They knew the Colonel was tracking every movement. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, checked his wristwatch. It was 3 o'clock. He noticed a black limousine park right outside the stage door. A courier walked inside carrying a fresh stack of script revisions. The new pages completely altered the final third of the movie. The studio had blinked under the Colonel's pressure. The new pages cut down Ann-Margret's musical numbers. They shifted 3 of her key lines to a minor male character. George Sidney took the new script pages and threw them into a trash can right in front of the studio courier. He refused to compromise the quality of his picture. He walked over to Ann-Margret and told her to ignore the revisions. He promised to shoot the scenes exactly as they were originally written. The set became a battleground between corporate control and artistic freedom. The crew members felt the strain. The cameramen had to shoot multiple versions of the same scene. They shot one version to satisfy the Colonel's demands, and another version to capture the real energy of the performers. Elvis found himself trapped in the middle of the war. He loved the film industry, but he hated the politics. On the final day of August, they filmed the climactic road race sequence. Elvis sat behind the wheel of a red sports car. Ann-Margret stood at the finish line, holding a checkered flag. The script called for a simple, joyful embrace when his character won the race. When the camera started rolling, the embrace lasted long after the director yelled, "Cut." The entire crew stood still, watching them hold onto each other on the hot asphalt. They weren't acting for the MGM Board of Directors anymore. They were holding on to a moment that was rapidly slipping away from them. The production was heading back to Memphis for the winter. The Las Vegas bubble was about to burst. The Colonel was already booking the next 3 movies, and none of them included a co-star who could match the King's stride. The shadow of the Graceland ultimatum. A black rotary telephone sat on a small nightstand inside the master bedroom at Graceland. It was late September, 1963. Priscilla Beaulieu picked up the receiver and listened to the long-distance dial tone. She dialed the number for the hotel suite in Los Angeles. She had spent the entire morning looking at a cutting from the Memphis Press Scimitar. The entertainment page featured a photograph of Elvis and Ann-Margret laughing outside a movie theater. The call went through to a member of the Memphis Mafia. Elvis didn't come to the phone right away. He was sitting downstairs in the hotel lobby, listening to his manager talk about a new 3-picture contract with Paramount Studios. Priscilla didn't slam the phone down. She waited on the line for 20 minutes until Elvis finally picked up the receiver. The conversation was short. She demanded to know if the newspaper articles were true. She asked him if she needed to pack her bags and return to her parents' home in Germany. Elvis didn't give her a straight answer. He told her that the press was just inventing stories to sell tickets for the movie. He hung up the phone and walked straight out to his car. The domestic pressure inside the gates of Graceland was becoming completely unmanageable. Priscilla was only 18 years old. She had been living at the mansion under a strict agreement with her father. Elvis had promised to protect her reputation and eventually marry her. Now, the entire world was watching him fall in love with a Hollywood starlet on the front pages of the morning papers. Colonel Tom Parker arrived at the hotel suite an hour later. He carried a leather briefcase filled with promotional schedules. He didn't care about Elvis's personal feelings, but he cared immensely about the legal arrangement with Priscilla's family. A public breakup or a scandal involving an underage girl would completely destroy the clean, family-friendly image Elvis had built since leaving the army. The Colonel laid out a stack of legal documents on the coffee table. He gave Elvis a direct choice. What did the Colonel threaten to do if Elvis refused to end the relationship with Ann-Margret? He threatened to cancel the upcoming winter holiday special and leak a story about Elvis's private medical records to the wire services. He told Elvis that a romance with a high-profile actress would ruin his box office value within 2 years. He explained that mainstream audiences wanted a predictable king, not a rebellious artist caught in a Hollywood love triangle. Elvis looked out the window at the Los Angeles traffic. He knew the Colonel was holding all the cards. The production crew gathered for the final week of pickups at the MGM lot. The atmosphere on the soundstage had completely changed. The easy laughter from the early days of shooting was entirely gone. Elvis stayed inside his dressing room between shots, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Ann-Margret arrived on set wearing a simple green dress for a continuity shot. She noticed the change immediately. The bodyguards were standing in front of Elvis's trailer doors like a human wall. They wouldn't let her pass. She walked over to the director's chair. George Sidney looked down at his clipboard. He told her that the studio had ordered him to wrap the production 3 days ahead of schedule. There would be no wrap party for the cast. The corporate machinery was moving at lightning speed to separate them before the press could capture any more evidence. On October 2nd, Elvis left Los Angeles without saying goodbye to the cast. He boarded a private train car bound for Memphis. His bodyguards loaded his luggage into the storage compartments in total silence. They didn't mention Ann-Margret's name during the entire 3-day journey across the country. When the train pulled into the Memphis station, Priscilla was waiting on the platform. She stood next to Elvis's father, Vernon Presley. Elvis stepped off the train and handed his coat to a porter. He walked over to Priscilla and kissed her on the cheek in front of the local news photographers. The flashes went off, capturing a perfect image of domestic reunion. The next morning, Elvis sat in the basement TV room at Graceland. He turned on the television set, but left the volume completely muted. He watched the screen in silence for hours. His cousin, Billy Smith, walked into the room carrying a fresh cup of coffee. He noticed a small, crumpled piece of hotel stationery sitting in the wastebasket near the couch. It was a note written in Elvis's handwriting, addressed to a telephone number in Beverly Hills. The note was never sent. The line had been drawn by the management and the family. Elvis had chosen his empire over his heart. He had protected the throne, but the cost of that protection was about to show up on the screen. The editing team in Hollywood was currently assembling the final cut of Viva Las Vegas, and they were about to realize that some moments cannot be erased by a studio memo. The heartbreak scene in frame. The camera crew locked the heavy Panavision lens into place on Soundstage 2. It was late afternoon. The lighting technician adjusted a single key light, casting a soft amber glow over a small wooden table. This was scene 74 of Viva Las Vegas. The script on the clipboard called for a standard, light-hearted conversation about the future. Lucky Jackson was supposed to grin. Rusty Martin was supposed to laugh. The director called action, and the two actors took their places. If you watch the movie today, you can skip the racetracks and the big dance numbers. The entire tragedy of their lives sits in this single, quiet 2-minute sequence. If you look closely at their eyes during these exact frames, you are no longer watching a Hollywood musical. Something went entirely wrong with the scripted dialogue the moment the camera started rolling. The scene required Ann-Margret to look at Elvis and ask him if he was ever going to settle down. According to the original studio screenplay, Elvis was supposed to deliver a quick, confident joke about loving the fast life. He was supposed to flash his famous crooked smile. He didn't deliver the line that way. He sat completely still. He looked down at his own hands for 4 long seconds. The camera operator, a veteran named Chief Cinematographer Loyal Griggs, noticed a sudden shift through his viewfinder. He didn't stop the film roll. Why did he keep the cameras tracking even when the lead actor missed his cue? He kept rolling because he realized he was capturing something completely raw. The silence on the set became heavy. When Elvis finally looked up, his face was entirely pale. He delivered the line about the fast life, but his voice cracked slightly on the final syllable. Ann-Margret didn't follow her next scripted prompt either. The script told her to roll her eyes and walk toward the door. Instead, she stayed anchored to the spot. She leaned her elbow on the table and reached out. Her fingers brushed against the sleeve of his shirt. The dialogue continued, but the words on the page completely lost their original meaning. They were talking about a fictional race car driver and a swimming instructor, but the expressions on their faces belonged to 2 real people who knew their time was officially up. The script supervisor, sitting in the corner with a stopwatch, noted the deviations in her logbook. She underlined line 14 twice. On that line, Ann-Margret looked directly into Elvis's eyes and asked if he would remember her when the summer ended. That specific question wasn't in the movie script. She had improvised it on the spot. Elvis didn't blink. He answered her by using her private nickname, Rusty. But he said it with an intensity that shocked the crew members standing behind the flats. He promised her that some things never change, no matter who tries to rewrite the ending. The scene was supposed to end with a bright musical transition. The studio musicians were already waiting in the adjacent room with their brass instruments ready. But the director didn't call for the music. He let the silence stretch out until the film reel inside the camera house literally ran out of tape. A loud clicking sound signaled the end of the roll. Only then did the director finally yell, "Cut." The crew didn't break out into their usual post-scene chatter. The lighting assistants stayed on their ladders. The makeup artists didn't rush forward with their brushes. Elvis stood up from the table without looking at anyone. He walked straight past his bodyguards and exited through the heavy soundstage doors into the bright California sunlight. Ann-Margret remained seated at the table for several minutes, staring at the empty chair across from her. The studio executives received the raw footage the following morning. They sat in their private viewing theater with pad and paper. They were supposed to authorize the scene for the final edit of the film. A major debate broke out in the dark room. One senior producer argued that the scene looked too dark. He complained that Elvis looked genuinely depressed rather than charming. He wanted the editors to scrap the entire take and force the actors to reshoot it with the original lighter dialogue. Why did the studio ultimately decide to keep this heartbreaking sequence in the final version of the movie? The answer lay in the financial reports of the marketing division. The test audiences who saw the early rough cuts of the film responded to that specific scene more than any other moment in the picture. They didn't see the sadness as a flaw. They saw it as the most magnetic piece of film Elvis had ever produced. The raw honesty of the performance was undeniable. The scene stayed in the movie. It became the emotional anchor of the entire project. When Viva Las Vegas finally opened in theaters across the nation, film critics picked up on the strange energy of that sequence immediately. A writer for the Los Angeles Times noted that the film seemed to split into two completely different movies during that specific scene. One movie was a colorful, superficial Hollywood fantasy. The other movie was a stark, painful document of a real-life parting. The audiences who queued outside the theaters in 1964 thought they were buying a ticket to a breezy summer romance. They had no idea they were witnessing the actual burial of a relationship. Every time that scene plays today, the frame carries the weight of everything that happened afterward. It captures the exact moment the corporate machine won the battle. Elvis went back to his prescribed life at Graceland, and Ann-Margret was steered toward her own Hollywood destiny. But for those 2 unscripted minutes under the studio lamps, they managed to tell the truth to each other while the whole world watched. The secret ritual of the yellow roses. A delivery truck pulled up to the backstage entrance of the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas. It was May 22, 1967. Ann-Margret was inside her dressing room, preparing for her massive solo stage debut. The room was packed with oversized floral arrangements from Hollywood studio heads and famous directors. She walked past the lilies and the carnations, looking for one specific package. She found it sitting on a small vanity table right next to her makeup mirror. It was a floral arrangement shaped exactly like a guitar. The flowers were bright yellow roses. She opened the small envelope attached to the stem. The card didn't have a long, dramatic poem written on it. It just had a short, handwritten message wishing her luck, signed with a private initial. The hotel staff didn't think much of the delivery. They assumed it was a standard promotional gesture from a fellow entertainer. But the arrival of those specific flowers marked the beginning of a strict, silent ritual that would last for an entire decade. Why did Elvis Presley choose this exact floral design to send to her backstage opening after opening? The origin of the gesture went back to a private conversation they had on the set of Viva Las Vegas in 1963. They were sitting on the back of a flatbed truck during a night shoot. Ann-Margret had mentioned that her favorite flowers were yellow roses because they reminded her of the warm summers in her childhood village. She also told him that she loved the raw, acoustic sound of his early Sun Records tracks before the big studio orchestras took over. Elvis never forgot that conversation. The guitar-shaped yellow roses became their private code. It was a silent signal that the corporate walls couldn't completely block out. The public had no idea this connection was still active. The media had moved on to other stories. Elvis had married Priscilla in a highly publicized Las Vegas ceremony just a few weeks prior to this opening night. Ann-Margret had married her manager, Roger Smith, a week after that. The world assumed they had closed the book on their summer romance and settled into their respective managed lives, but the corporate scripts couldn't control the real-life calendar. Every single time Ann-Margret launched a new show in Las Vegas, Lake Tahoe, or New York, the exact same delivery arrived at her dressing room. The florists changed and the delivery drivers changed, but the guitar shape and the yellow roses stayed exactly the same. Elvis's private security team handled the logistics. Joe Esposito received strict orders to place the order with local flower shops 2 weeks before any of her openings. He had to use cash from a private ledger, so the expenses wouldn't show up on the main corporate accounts audited by Colonel Tom Parker. The Colonel was constantly monitoring Elvis's spending, but he never managed to track down the floral payments. In the winter of 1972, Elvis's own life was completely unraveling. His marriage to Priscilla ended in a bitter separation. He was spending his nights locked inside the penthouse suite of the International Hotel, surrounded by prescription pill bottles and trusted bodyguards. He rarely left the room, except to walk down the service elevator straight to the stage. Ann-Margret's career was moving in the exact opposite direction. She had just received an Academy Award nomination for her dramatic role in the movie Carnal Knowledge. She was finally breaking free from the cartoon sex symbol image the studios had forced on her. She booked a return engagement at the International Hotel, performing in the main showroom right after Elvis wrapped his summer residency. Did they try to meet face-to-face when their paths crossed in the same hotel corridors? Or did they keep their distance? They didn't schedule a private dinner. They didn't risk a meeting in the public lounges where the reporters were waiting. Instead, Elvis stayed on his floor until her opening night arrived. On that evening, he didn't just send the flowers. He walked down the back stairwell with 3 of his largest bodyguards. He slipped into the dark booth at the very back of the showroom, right as the house lights dimmed. He sat there in total darkness, watching her entire 90-minute performance without moving a muscle. When the final curtain came down and the crowd erupted into applause, Elvis stood up and walked back to the service elevator before the house lights could come back on. He didn't go to her backstage dressing room. He knew her husband was waiting there with the studio executives. He just went back to his dark penthouse, satisfied that he had seen her conquer the room on her own terms. The years kept rolling by, and the deliveries never missed a date. By 1976, Elvis's physical health was completely failing. His voice was still powerful, but his body was broken by the grueling tour schedule and the heavy medication. His weight was fluctuating wildly, and the tabloids were printing cruel pictures of his stage appearances. Ann-Margret received her final delivery of yellow roses in the summer of 1977. She was opening a new engagement in Los Angeles. The flowers arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, looking exactly like the arrangement she had received 10 years earlier in Las Vegas. She placed the card inside her jewel case, intending to send a thank you note through his private courier line after the weekend shows wrapped. She never got the chance to write that note. On August 16, 1977, she was sitting in her living room when the television flash announced that Elvis had passed away at Graceland. The ritual was officially over. The yellow roses would never show up at her dressing room door again. But the final, most devastating chapter of their Hollywood story was about to be written in the mud of a Memphis cemetery. The echo at the funeral. A heavy gray fog rolled across the boulevard in Memphis on August 18, 1977. The humidity was stifling. Tens of thousands of fans lined the perimeter of the Graceland gates. They were crying, singing hymns, and holding cheap plastic candles. A line of white limousines sat idling on the asphalt drive, their exhaust pipes sending small plumes of smoke into the damp morning air. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was entirely cold. Hollywood executives and music industry power players stood in the formal dining room. They were drinking coffee and discussing contract logistics for upcoming memorial records. A sleek black sedan pulled through the iron gates. The crowd outside went silent as a woman stepped out of the back seat. Ann-Margret adjusted her dark sunglasses and pulled a black veil tightly over her hair. She didn't stop to talk to the reporters. She walked past the studio heads without nodding. The Hollywood establishment had largely stayed away from the funeral. They sent telegrams. They released corporate statements to the evening news. They were already shifting their attention to the next big market trend. Ann-Margret was one of the incredibly few co-stars from Elvis's cinematic past who actually traveled to Memphis to face the reality of his death. Why did she choose to break Hollywood protocol and stand before the cameras at his burial? The reason lay in a final phone call she received 3 days before his heart stopped. Elvis had dialed her private number from a hotel room during his final tour stop. He didn't talk about Hollywood projects. He asked her if she still remembered the quiet diner they visited outside Las Vegas in 1963. He told her he felt completely overwhelmed by the constant demands of his touring schedule. He said he felt like a ghost trapped inside a gilded cage. She had promised to visit him at Graceland after his tour wrapped. The visit never happened. Now, she walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the formal living room. The copper coffin rested under a bank of heavy velvet draperies. Vernon Presley sat in a wooden chair by the corner, his head buried in his hands. He looked up as Ann-Margret approached. He didn't see a Hollywood starlet. He saw the woman his son had spent a decade talking about in the quiet hours of the night. Vernon stood up and took her by the hand. He led her directly to the edge of the casket. The rest of the room seemed to fade into total shadow. Ann-Margret looked down at the face of her old co-star. The glittering jumpsuits were gone. The bright stage lights were dark. She pulled a single object from the pocket of her black coat. It was a small, dried yellow rose from the arrangement he had sent to her final Los Angeles opening. She slid the flower gently into the side of the casket lining, completely out of sight of the public photographers. Did the family object to this highly personal gesture from an old flame? The family did the exact opposite. Vernon Presley leaned over and whispered a private message into her ear. He thanked her for never selling her story to the tabloid magazines. He told her that Elvis had kept a private scrapbook filled with her movie clippings locked inside his personal desk drawer until his very last day. He said that Ann-Margret was the only woman who ever truly understood the weight of the crown Elvis wore. She stayed by the casket for 3 minutes. She didn't weep dramatically. She just stood there in total silence, staring at the man who had changed the entire trajectory of her youth. When she finally turned to leave, she passed Priscilla Presley standing near the front door. The two women didn't speak. They didn't exchange angry glances. They simply looked at each other for a brief second, sharing an unspoken understanding of the corporate machine that had dictated all of their lives. Ann-Margret walked back down the front steps of the mansion into the sweltering Memphis heat. The fans at the gate pressed against the iron bars, trying to catch a glimpse of her face through the dark veil. She got back into the black sedan and told the driver to head straight for the airport. She didn't stay for the wake. She didn't attend the formal luncheon at the hotel. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked out the back window at the sea of flowers covering the lawn. The image directly mirrored the scene from 1964, when her character stood at the finish line watching Lucky Jackson drive away into the desert sunset. The Hollywood script had finally merged completely with real life. The curtain had come down on the king, and the girl from Sweden was left to carry the memory of their secret alliance entirely alone. The director yelled cut, but the heartbreak never stopped rolling. Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret gave Hollywood its most electric pairing, but the cost of that 1964 magic was a lifetime of quiet regret. They proved that the corporate machine could manage their careers, but it could never touch the genuine bond they forged under the studio lamps.